Good evening, friends. Welcome to the India Power Talk. India Power Talk is a knowledge sharing initiative. We invite international thought leaders and domain experts to share their insights, experiences, and strategies related to business and the economy. The result is an easily accessible digital source of knowledge that benefits not only Indian entrepreneurs and policymakers, but also international businesses, investors, and strategic partners who have invested in or intend to invest in India. Our speakers include entrepreneurs, economists, professors, investment bankers, inventors, scientists, lawyers, and other senior professionals with experience in diverse sectors. Our topic today is a fast-growing class of financial instrument that many say will enable unprecedented financial inclusion and equality, the digital assets. The most widely known digital asset is Bitcoin, a blockchain-based cryptocurrency that was introduced in the wake of financial and economic crisis in 2008. It was intended as a digital currency that would be independent of central banks. But Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies represent only a small part of digital asset and their potential. The many variants include, for example, digital tokens that allow investors to purchase small or shares in real world assets with minimal transaction fee. At the same time, such tokens can be used as rewards. For example, when consumers allow online retailers or other access to their data. Regulators around the world are taking different approaches to this new asset class, some embarrassing it and some prohibiting, and majority adopting a wait and see attitude. But even at this early stage, most experts agree that digital assets with a market capitalization of over 1 trillion US dollar and growing are here to stay. India is one of the jurisdictions that seems to have taken a restrictive stance on digital assets. We want to take a deeper look at this asset class and what it means for India's future. I am glad to say our guest is the most ideal and qualified person to provide insight into this topic. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome Loretta Joseph, a public policy expert and globally recognized authority in digital asset regulation and blockchain technology. Loretta is a highly skilled banking, financial, and consulting professional with over 25 years of experience in financial markets and related sectors. She has worked for major investment banks at board, managing director, and or senior management level throughout Asia and South Asia, including RBS India, Macquarie Group India, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, and Elara Capital India. Loretta has advised many international banks, global hedge and pension funds on portfolio management and exposure to derivatives and related products. For the last decade, she has been paramount in successful transactions facilitation for foreign investors in India and other emerging markets. Loretta sits on the advisory board of UWS Business School and Bloom Ventures India. She is an adjunct fellow of UWS Lifetime Fellow of the Advisory Board of Australian Digital Currency and Commerce Association and holds various advisory positions for multiple tech, biotech, and cryptocurrency security companies. Loretta champions the cause of a responsible blockchain adoption with global governments, regulators, and industry players. She has been recognized with awards like the FinTech Australia Leader of 2017, Female Leader of 2016, and Skanta Sophia College Alumni Award 2016 for social impact. Her topic for India Power Talk today is the future of digital assets. Why, what, and how. She would speak on what are financial assets, possible regulations for India, and their advantages. So welcome, Loretta. I'm so happy that you are joining us on India Power Talk. Thank you for being here. Now, before we deep dive into the world of digital assets, I would love to hear from you your stint and connect with India.
So thanks, Nitin. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so my connect to India goes back to the early 2000s. I lived and worked in India for most of that decade. As you said, I was a derivatives trader. I've run a couple of banks and I've worked for a number of banks around Asia and in India. So yeah, I love India. I went with eyes wide shut, actually. I mean, I arrived in India as a single white female with a child on her own. Probably what I know now and what I knew then probably may have changed my idea about moving to India, but I'm glad that it didn't, and I'm glad that I did. Yeah, India taught me many things. It taught me no doesn't mean no. You just ask the question a different way. You have a lot of patience in life, and there's always two sides to every story. So yeah, that's a mantra that I live by. India showed me some of the best years of my life. So I have a deep connection to India. My little girl, actually, she speaks Hindi, Marathi, Tamil.
Oh.
And she writes Hindi. So yeah, we have a deep connection. She's not Indian by birth, but yeah, she perceives herself to be quite Indian.
Great. Thank you so much, really, Loretta, and I really admire your India Connect. Now, let me quickly move to the digital assets. In my introduction, I've tried to give our viewers a brief introduction of the digital assets, but you are the expert, and could you please explain this new asset class in some detail, just to set the context, I guess.
So digital assets are a new asset class. It's the first asset class that I've seen the birth of, so that's pretty exciting. I've, in my life as a derivatives trader and a banker for many years, I think I've traded every asset class. Securities, bonds, debentures, commodities, you name it, fixed income. So it's a new asset class. It's not necessarily all financial, but Bitcoin was the first application of a technology called blockchain. Now, what that did, it digitalized money. Now, money means something very different to everybody. Money is not exactly currency. Money came out of when we used to exchange things like corn and wheat, and then we moved on to shells. So money means something different to everybody. But Bitcoin essentially was the digitalization of money. And it proved that the underlying technology could allow us to digitalize money. But since Bitcoin, there's been many new protocols come along, many new blockchains, and we can now, with the technology, digitalize any asset class. So that's an existing asset class, whether it be a bond, a debenture, a security, and we can also digitalize asset classes that don't exist. So we're seeing asset classes start to be born that we never even envisaged, and that happens because of the underlying technology called blockchain. So digital assets are intangible and they're tangible, and I think that's the exciting thing about this new asset class. It's assets that we understand. We can digitalize any asset that exists, but it's also assets that we don't understand. And digital assets are important because for a very long time, I've traded most asset classes. You look at a lot of them and they're very liquid. So things like, gold, in India, everybody loves to wear gold, but if you want to resell it, it's a very illiquid asset. Other than wearing it, what do you do with it? Other than expecting it to go up in value. And if you want to resell it, it's a very difficult process. So now we're seeing with the digitalization, we're seeing liquidity come into secondary markets. And I think that's what Bitcoin and the first application of a lot of cryptocurrencies showed us, that we could now move into liquid markets in secondary markets very, very quickly. So that is a digital asset in a nutshell. They exist. All the assets that we know, that there's new assets that don't exist now, and we have this birth of these new assets like cryptocurrencies and other virtual assets.
Loretta, really, thank you so much for that very simplistic, explanation, and I'm sure you must have done it many times. But thank you again for that. Now, you are a senior banker and you have worked for many international banks in Asia and also particularly in India. Now, if I may ask you, how did you originally become interested in digital assets, and how did you move from the hard currency to digital assets? And what attracted you?
So I read a book called The Blockchain Revolution by a man called Don Tapscott, who's become quite a good friend of mine. And it talked about decentralized databases. And blockchain, in essence, to simplify it in layman's terms, all blockchain is a very fancy word for a database. Now, we use databases every day. We use Excel spreadsheets. You all use databases, but the difference between the databases that we've used up until the time that Bitcoin came along and blockchain was that they're centralized. So they have a central point of control. Decentralized databases are not controlled by anybody. they are secure, they're immutable, and they're transparent. So it means that anybody in the world can log onto their computer and look at this database, which nobody can change, nobody can tamper with, but it's transparent to everyone. So it's not controlled by a central party. So that's in essence what blockchain is. And I think people confuse it. You know, a lot of technologists who are quite young, you know, they use terms that don't explain things to the layman. Now, so I was working for this stock exchange, and one of my biggest problems as a trader for 30 years of my life was that I could trade any asset, but the amount of time it would take to clear and settle that asset was very long and very varied. So if you trade an equity, it could take 3 days. If you're trading a bond, it can take 2 days. If you're trading a water entitlement, do not ask me why, but it takes 30 days to clear. So we have this great disconnect between trading an asset and the clearing and settlement of that asset. And that's affected most of us traders for our lives. So I looked at blockchain not because of Bitcoin, but because how I could bring clearing and settlement times from 2 to 3 days to 0, because it's what we call, when transactions are done on the blockchain, they're done instantaneously. So I looked at it from that angle, and I looked to build a pilot clearing and settlement system for a stock exchange. So then in about 2011, I looked at Bitcoin. So this was still early, and I mean, I think I wish I had bought more, but a Bitcoin in those days was trading about $40, and it's this morning it was 23,000. So so I've never bought any Bitcoin per se since those days. I've been given a lot and I've lost a lot, but so I went to buy some Bitcoin, and it was a very difficult process, and I couldn't work out why. So then I started to talk to the people that were running these sort of cryptocurrency exchanges, and I didn't really understand Bitcoin. So I spent the next 4 years of my life doing a deep dive into the ecosystem. You know, I spent time in pinball parlors in New York. I spent times in the slums in Delhi. I spent times in university courtyards in Russia. And I was trying to figure out what these kids had built. So when I figured out that Bitcoin, you know, was this apparently, this internet money, it worked out to me that the people that built it didn't really understand financial markets and financial products. So, you know, now looking back at what Bitcoin is, it's a commodity. And I write laws around the world. And if you trace back the first ever Bitcoin transaction, it was deemed a commodity in a court of law in the US. So Bitcoin's not money. And I think, you know, the ecosystem, had they have called Bitcoin Zen token, no regulator, no central bank would have really cared around the world. But the minute, you know, this ecosystem is full of young millennial technologists who borrowed terms from financial markets and financial products. So they took the term coin, they took the term currency, and Bitcoin's not a currency and it's not a coin. Other cryptocurrencies are not currencies, they're commodities. So they borrowed names, and regulators and central banks got a bit confused and a bit hyped up because they thought that their mandates were being trampled upon. So I set about in 2014 in Australia. I helped set up something called the Australian Digital Chamber of Commerce, and I set about writing the self-regulation of Bitcoin, because I figured, you know, when I went to try and buy some Bitcoin on a cryptocurrency exchange, and these exchanges are not exchanges, by the way. When I think of an exchange, I think of deep market infrastructure of a security exchange, which are public-private partnerships between the government and private enterprises, but they're very onerous. They have market rules, they have a number of investors, and they're onerous because they're infrastructure. Right. So these cryptocurrency exchanges are not exchanges in that sense of the word. They're just marketplaces. They match buyers and sellers. So I just wish, you know, looking back over time, had we have all sort of talked about the same thing. And then so I wrote the first self-regulation for Bitcoin in Australia, and then slow and behold, I think that's been adopted by about 39 countries. So that was my first introduction into regulation and law. And then I remember in about 2015, we in Australia, we worked very closely with our government to come up with the definition. So what was a digital asset? So I was looking, I had one part of my government referring to this new asset class as a digital asset. The Attorney General's office were referring to them as crypto assets. The money laundering and terrorism regulator, anti-terrorism body regulator, referring to them as virtual assets. But in inherent everything was the same thing, but we all had different names. And I really wish, I've spent the last 7 years of my life trying to bring standards and harmonized definitions across the world, so we're all referring to the same thing. So this digital asset is a new asset class, and things like cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Ethereum, they're just subsets of this new asset class.
They are commodities.
Yes, they're commodities. So they're not currency, and they're not, money means different things to different people, but fiat currency, as we see, with the rupee, with the stamp on it and someone's head, we refer that as fiat currency. That's the sovereign currency of a nation. And so I've spent the last 7 years aligning definitions globally, making sure that, central banks weren't confused about this new asset class, and it wasn't in fact currency per se, it's more a commodity. So I've written a lot of regulations around that. My self-regulation went quite well. I wrote the first ever legislation in the world in 2018 in Bermuda on digital assets, and we also wrote legislation on something called an initial coin offering, which was effectively a digital crowd fund, but it's done with cryptocurrencies. So there was a lot of these new terms coming in that they needed a lot of clarification about what we were talking about. Regulators were scared because there was no regulation when I first started to look at cryptocurrencies. People were getting scammed, investors and consumers were getting ripped off. So all we did, and that's all regulation does. We set about writing standards and regulations that protect people and defining what this new asset class is. So I'm very pleased with, over the last 7 years of my life, that I've probably impacted the world considerably in bringing in proper regulation and proper definitions around digital assets, and explaining deeply what crypto assets are and cryptocurrencies, and working with a number of standard set of bodies around the world. I've worked with the OECD. I've done a lot of work with the Financial Action Task Force, which is the money laundering, terrorism financing regulator of the world. And we have to abide by these regulations no matter what we're involved in, because none of us want people to blow people up. None of us want people to be trafficked. There's regulations in place for reasons, and there are different levels. Securities regulators want consumers, investors to be protected. And, the technologists that build these new systems, they also need legal clarity. And that they're not breaking the law. Most of them are just trying to build businesses. They're entrepreneurs. Do they really care about regulation or definitions? No. But if they're going to be accepted mainstream, and we're seeing digital assets become very mainstream, and institutions getting faith in them, there has to be sets of rules and guidelines which protect jurisdictions and protect consumers, investors, stop the bad guys doing bad things with technology, but also allow for innovation and technology to be driven, that it does create entrepreneurs, and it creates wealth and economic prosperity to countries. So no regulation is bad. Over-regulation is even worse. We have to work with the innovators. I work very closely with policy, with governments, with regulators, and with the industry to make sure, just like the internet taught us that the walled garden approach doesn't work. So we all have to work together and collaborate to make sure the new rules that we're building for this new digital economy actually works for everybody.
So Loretta, before you really move deep into the subjects, and I'm so glad that you have really understood and mastered the subject. Now, 3 sub questions which came out, which I have curiosity on from, and would like to know from you. I would like to know 3 things from you based on the elaborate answer that you gave. One is, you said this young generation who created the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, they didn't really understand the meaning of what they're doing. It is a commodity, as you rightly said, and they were creating a business model, honestly, to tell the truth. Now, could you throw some light on what was their mindset when they created this Bitcoin? Number one. And number two, you said that, look, it can't be misused, or what could be its misuse. But before that also, if you were asked today, if we were to move the time behind, and if some young entrepreneurs, some technologists had come to you saying that we have created this commodity, now what is the name that you would like to give to Bitcoin or cryptocurrency? I would love to hear from you. What is the name you would have given to them in 2000, probably 2008 or 12?
So I'll answer your first question in part. So in 2008, 2009, for those people that don't know, a group of persons, somebody called Satoshi Nakamoto, put on the internet a very detailed paper. It's about 8 pages. And it talks about a cashless payment system.
Yes.
But it also talks in that paper, and for anybody that wants to go and read about it, it's on the internet. It's called the Bitcoin White Paper. It's open source. It's available to everybody. And so Satoshi talked about a world, after the GFC, which is very timely because it came out just as the GFC hit. And I was a trader in the GFC. I understand how the financial system did get broken, and to be honest, I don't believe the financial system has been fixed. So there was this group of libertarians. Nobody knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is. We have a good indication that that it was a group of people. I think what it did show was more so that they created this commodity which had characteristics more like digital gold. So when I write laws and regulation around things like Bitcoin, it is a commodity, but it's a commodity because it has characteristics more akin to physical gold and physical commodities. It's a store of value. Designed as a payment system, but the way that Bitcoin itself works, it's very slow, it's very clunky for transactions because it's what we call a public blockchain. Everybody in the world can join the Bitcoin blockchain. Everybody can see every transaction that takes place from the first ever Bitcoin transaction, which we call the Genesis block. Satoshi designed it so there's 21 million Bitcoins in existence. That's it. And he gave the people that look after the network, they're called miners, and the miners get incentivized by earning Bitcoin to maintain the integrity of the network. But anybody can come into a miner. Think of it like a very large community of users around the world that are all talking to each other. They're all watching transactions go through on this database. None of them can change it. None of them can remove anything off it, but they can all partake in it. So it's not a payment system. And if you understand the technology behind it, so blockchain itself and Satoshi Nakamoto's vision was a combination of 3 technologies. One, cryptography, which is encryption of messages, which has been around since the Second World War. Second was the internet. Now, I spent, as I'm female, because females always ask questions, when I first started to get into blockchain and Bitcoin in 2012, 2013, I was a banker. I didn't understand anything about building open systems and the technology behind things like the internet. So I went, all right, well, who could probably tell me this? So I Googled who built the internet. And a man called Robert Kahn came up. So Robert Kahn wrote what we call the Transmission Control Protocol and the Internet Protocol. So see, he sent a message for the first time in history across an open network to a man called Vint Cerf, which said hello. Now that was the inception of the Internet Protocol. Now, Rob's become a very good friend of mine. He's become my mentor. He's taught me to code. I've learned more about open source systems and open systems than I ever probably thought I ever would, but I understand the technology behind it. But the interesting thing about the internet, when Bob built it, he's an electrical engineer, it was built without a security protocol layer. So we all use the internet every day. We send messages, we transact value across an open network. But the problem with the internet, and when he designed it, because it came out of US defense, they were told not to add a security protocol layer. So the internet's not secure. It's the least secure thing that any of us use. People hack it, intercept messages. So when Bitcoin came along, and please let this be the only thing you take from my talk today, if you take one takeaway, it's that Bitcoin solved the security problem of the internet.
Yes.
It added a security protocol layer onto the internet to make it safe. And that's what Bitcoin is about. So it was built by Satoshi. He talked about a payment system, which it's not, but it takes 10 minutes for every block in the blockchain, we call it, to be verified by everybody using the network. It's very slow, it's very clunky, but it does one thing, and it does one thing very well. It makes it secure. And it's an infrastructure. If you look at it in history, the internet was an infrastructure. You don't know when you use your telephone, Nitin, that there's 49 protocol layers developed on top of what Bob built. from the first internet protocol. Nobody cares. We just use our phones and it's infrastructure. So that's really what Bitcoin is. It's more of an infrastructure. It's security. And Satoshi built it because he really did value his privacy. And it was a time in the GFC that, they didn't like governments, they didn't like banks. We lost a lot of faith in financial systems. So this was built as an alternative to the financial system of centralized systems. It's a decentralized system, but, it's very libertarian. I think, like everything that's libertarian in the world, it's proved to me over the last 10 years that world of anarchy, libertarianism won't coexist with the world of centralization. And yet, do we trust banks and governments? Probably not. But the internet taught us that we have to work in the middle to collaborate, because nothing's going to work on the edge. Bitcoin, in essence, is never going to work, and it's never going to replace the financial system, and nor should it, and nor was it intended to. But it has showed us that there are viable alternatives to managing financial systems. So that's what Bitcoin is in an essence, and why it was built. So it came out of this great libertarian world. I've had, I'm a bit of a sleuth these days, because I find Satoshi Nakamoto, or who's behind it, the most fascinating thing. I've spent the last 10 years of my life researching it. And my own belief is that it couldn't have been a bunch of just technologists that came up with this system. There's no way. It had to be somebody that understood central bank governing, because the complication and the prudential regulations around central banks are embedded into this system. So it couldn't have been somebody that didn't understand financial systems. It couldn't have been just an electrical engineer, that came out of something called the cyberpunk movements in the 1960s and 70s. So it had to be, a group of people that understood more than they let on in their white paper. So I find that very fascinating. Your second part of the question was, sorry.
What would the name that you would have given to Bitcoin?
I like Zen token, because I think it doesn't hurt anybody. Everyone finds that quite palatable. But I think a token, some sort of it's not a payment token, it's sort of a store of value. So, I think had they've called it digital gold, it would have been a much easier way to describe it to people. Some of the other blockchains and some of the other cryptocurrencies that don't work on the Bitcoin protocol, that work on their own blockchains, things like Ethereum, Litecoin, they do have protocols that are trying to be payment systems, but they're too early at the moment. You've got problems of scalability, interoperability between blockchains. And if you look at the financial system, like the amount of transactions that go through SWIFT, they're millions a second. And none of these protocols are anywhere near that throughput. That's what we call it in the technical terms, throughput. So I think, I think that'll get solved over the next decade, but it's still an industry that's very new. Bitcoin's only 30 years old. It took the internet, from what Bob built, took the internet 30 years to get to where, to being something that was socially adopted.
But I guess, the first challenge is that regulators, when they hear the words like Bitcoin, coin, or a cryptocurrency, the minute they hear the words like coin or currency, the fear is that, are you going to replace my currency? Are you going to take over my rights to regulate my economy? That's the first fear that regulators have in their mind. And that's the biggest obstacle in really allowing other regulators to adopt the Bitcoin technology or the blockchain technology, I guess.
So I work very closely, and actually one of my other mentors, other than Bob Kahn, and it's so funny, in this very new technology space, I probably have the two oldest mentors in the planet. So Bob's 85. I also work very closely with Lord Magnum Desai, who's my mentor. Lord Desai
UK.
He's a member of the House of Lords. He's taught, as far as central bank and macroeconomics goes, he's number one, I think, in the world.
Yes.
As far as that goes, he's taught, of 17 central bank governors I know sitting in office today, Lord Desai has taught 14. There is nobody that understands macroeconomics and central bank governing better than Lord Desai. So he understands blockchain and Bitcoin because of me. It's one thing we do as central banks. This is not, and in the laws that I wrote, I always say, this is not legal tender. because that takes out the mandate of a central bank to worry about what they're talking about. These things are commodities, you know, they shouldn't worry central banks. They're not going to replace financial systems as they stand. You know, there are alternatives maybe, but, you know, social adoption of these things and sovereign currencies, you know, are not going to disappear. But I wish, you know, as I said, some governments are referring to crypto assets, some are talking about digital assets. You've got the Financial Action Task Force, which is the money laundering, terrorism financing standard setter of the world. They refer to it as virtual assets. I wish we had one term that everybody would be comfortable with.
Absolutely.
Because all these different terms, you know, crypto assets or cryptocurrencies and coins and currencies and you know, tokens, what are they? It's very overwhelming for a lot of regulators are not technologists, and technologists are not regulators. So when you have these two different worlds that don't understand each other, or, you know, thinking and confusing each other, it's been very problematic over the last 5 years to get any you know, legal clarity and any sort of you know, harmonization of regulations and standards.
Let's move from the basic regulatory framework of or what bitcoins or cryptocurrencies. Now let's move it to the completely different domain. Now, where do you see the greatest potential for financial inclusion and empowering financial precarious populations via cryptocurrency or via bitcoins?
So I'll give you an example. So I've spent a lot of my life in the emerging markets. I love emerging markets, you know. But one thing, you know, and I always say to regulators in the non-emerging world, the first world, the US and the Canada and Australia, UK. The problem is when they look at financial systems, you have financial inclusion of people, and in most of those first world countries, yeah, they have 90 somewhere between 95 and 98% you know, of all their citizens have bank accounts. When you go into Africa and India, you flip that on your head. You know, financial inclusion can be exclusion up to about 95% of people's populations. So, I mean, I look at the technology, not just because of Bitcoin, but what's one of the biggest problems we have sitting in 2021? It's the digital identification, you know, and people are not ID'd, and it happens, people in the emerging world quite often don't have identifications. But if you don't have an identification, you can't have a bank account. You can't be included in the financial system. You can't vote. You can't get a passport. You can't do many things. You can't buy land. So that's probably the biggest issue that we see in the modern world, is we haven't had the ability, you know, with the signatures 600 years old, it's very outdated. We do everything on our mobile devices, but, you know, we go into banks and we go into governments and they want photocopies of your passport or your birth certificate or your driver's license, and they want them in multiples. People forge them. People, you know, copy them. There are so many problems with the way we use information in a manual system.
Yes.
The first thing we need to solve is, you know, the digital ID. But if you look in places like India and the Aadhaar, and you look in Africa, mobile devices, for at least the last 15 years, have stepped in, and telecom providers have stepped in to be the banks where there's been no banking facilities.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I will work in Nigeria. I work with the Financial Intelligence Unit. I will tell you, in Nigeria, we have over 60 million users of Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if you look at India, that the social adoption of these mobile payments and things like cryptocurrencies has escalated beyond anybody.
Absolutely.
You know, thought, because, you know, we have access, our kids have access to these mobile devices. So you can't look at it as though people are not delving, and especially young populations, they understand mobile devices, they understand mobile payments. So, yeah, and if you look at things like remittances around the world, Western Union, even bank transfers, you know, they can take days. They're very expensive, very inefficient. Cross-border payments are ridiculous in 2021 for the inefficiencies and the amount of money they cost. Remittances, if you're remitting money back from Canada, you know, into the Philippines, or from Australia into India, or, you know, the UK into Africa, that the cost to move that remittance may cost you somewhere between 12% and 20%. Now, if I'm moving $20,000 or, you know, 1 lakh of rupee, That's all right. But if I'm moving, say from Canada back into Gujarat, 1,000 rupee to my grandmother every month, and it's costing me 200 rupee to do that, that's a huge hit to my bottom line. So these alternative payment systems, whether they be mobile, whether they be cryptocurrencies, take out the friction in systems, and they take out where middlemen make money.
Yes.
So I think, they're incredible technological advances that we're seeing, and that's why we're seeing so much social adoption.
In fact, the pandemic has really helped help fast forward the digitization process.
Absolutely. I mean, who would have thought, 2 years ago that we'd all be working from home? The future of home would be sitting on your Zoom in your bedroom, in your corner all day. The future of work arrived without anybody realizing it or anybody expecting it, and it's here. And even central bank digital currencies. I mean, if you looked at the way throughout the pandemic that governments were struggling to get money into people's pockets.
Yes.
To helicopter money into the most needy people, central banks have gone, oh, well, if we had systems, central bank digital currencies, not cryptocurrencies, but they're digital representations of fiat currency. If there are ways now for central banks to interact directly with people, I have a few problems about where technology can take us and the unintended consequences of doing things like giving central banks total control over people's money, because that's not democratic. So I think we have to be careful when we're using technology for the unintended consequences. Like, do we want governments and central banks to control people's money and control generations down? Do I want my daughter's grandchildren to have total control by governments and institutions? Probably not. So we have technology, we have huge advancements, but sometimes we've also got to step back and think, are we doing this for the right reasons or the wrong reasons?
Correct. Great. So we can the advantages of this currencies and the technology is very visible. It's in India, it is very visible. Now, what is your experience with the global regulators? I mean, regulators definitely they are the people who will move the whole entire ecosystem and make it available. So what is your experience with the global regulators, number one, and what are the challenges that you really see, particularly in a country like India?
So I think global regulators have struggled, to have a global definition of what we're talking about. As I said, people talk about digital currencies, they talk about virtual assets, they talk about crypto assets, they talk about cryptocurrencies. Tokens are just digital representations of assets. So you've got all this new jargon and all these noises, and regulators have struggled to understand what they're regulating. As I said, if you're looking at what people were thinking. So that's number one. And central banks were very confused. Securities regulators were going, well, are these things securities? Well, obviously, securities regulators, protect consumers, investors, but many securities regulators around the world, haven't wanted to dive in, and they've left this space largely unregulated because they don't understand how to do it. So that's been a huge challenge to me over the last number of years. I think when the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, who are the money laundering terrorism standards setting body, came in in 2018, they said, right, if nobody else is going to regulate this, we're going to put our hand up. So they came up with a whole sleuth of recommendations about virtual assets and virtual asset service providers in this space for the providers of money laundering and terrorism purposes. So a lot of other regulators have sort of stepped back. Prudential regulators have been very slow to regulate, but I don't think that's a bad idea because, prudential regulators regulate banks and financial institutions. Is this stuff all financial products? No, I don't think it is. Commodities can be financial products when you get into things like derivatives. I think if some of these young people and start doing derivatives on top of crypto assets and cryptocurrencies, your financial products. But where's the line drawn about? So Some countries have, have been very receptive. I found the smaller jurisdictions that are more nimble, a lot of the islands where I work, have been very happy to come in and write regulatory frameworks. Because I'll give you an example. When I went to Bermuda in 2018, Bermuda's a country of 60,000 people. So we were the first country to give legal clarity and come up with a legislative framework for digital assets. Now that has attracted about over 200 fintech companies, financial technology companies, to the island, because they had legal clarity about what they could and can't do. That injected so much money into that economy of 60,000 people, because entrepreneurs just want to build businesses. And this space, you talked about it earlier, it's $1 trillion space. Looks at things like decentralized finance and non-fungible tokens. They're in the billions of dollars now. We're not stopping these assets. They're here to stay. And this ecosystem has a lot of money in it. So
which country you said? Which country?
Bermuda.
I'm sorry?
Bermuda. A little island in the Atlantic Ocean that's got 60,000 people. So yeah, that really showed me that there's economic and social importance to having legal clarity, because you can inject so much money from an ecosystem if you can let it thrive. And these entrepreneurs, these technologists, they're young. I do a lot of work with a number of the large exchanges. Some of them turn over, $2-3 billion a day. Yeah, they're unicorns. They're $20 billion companies and that have risen in 5 years. So these kids are building businesses and they're not going away. They will go anywhere in the world because the nature of the assets is they're decentralized, they're global. They can be anywhere, but they will go somewhere where they have legal clarity of what they do isn't going to put them in jail, or they can, they have the right side of the law on their side. And that's what regulation is about. Regulation is not about me telling somebody that they can use technology or they can't. I can't stop my 17-year-old using her mobile device, and nobody can. We shouldn't be in the business of regulating technology, but we can regulate the service providers that use that technology and the products within it. So I think that's really important for regulation. That's been struggling. Over the last 5 years, I've seen some harmonisation, standards have been set. The small countries are leading the charge. And I think it comes down to financial inclusion too. As I said, we're looking at 100 million users of Bitcoin in Nigeria. There's 270 million people in the country, but that happened overnight. So the regulators have gone, what do we do now? So, I evoke that there be responsible regulation. We don't want to kill innovation. We don't want to kill it, but we do want to stop nefarious actors using this ecosystem for bad. Now, like the internet, we found bad actors will always use technology, but people will use it for good things. In the days of when Bob told me he built the internet, he got told, first of all, to shut it down. He said, well, I can't do that because there's an open network. And then about 10 years later, the same people that wanted him to shut it down wanted to buy it. He said, no, I can't do that either. So its systems are not going away, and we can't ignore technology. We can't. And social adoption of technology is becoming so rife in emerging markets. The Americans, the SEC in America, the Federal Reserve, and in Europe, they can't agree on anything. There's so many different state regulators, there's different federal regulators, but their social adoption is not at levels we see in the emerging world. So I see the emerging world taking a leading role in this and writing regulations, just because the want of the hour is that we need them, and we need them fast.
So what are the challenges do you really see in the emerging world?
The challenges I see is that you have a lot of people using systems when you have no regulation. So that's a challenge, or to try and ban. Banning certain things in technology doesn't work, because this ecosystem came from the shadows. Regulation makes things mainstream. It makes social adoption easier because you start to regulate. You stop bad actors using things for bad reasons. But banning stuff doesn't help. All it does is push, this technology back into the shadows where it came from, and people are still going to use it. We can't shut down the internet. We can't shut down the Bitcoin network. It's interesting, to shut Bitcoin is now impossible, because it's 2/3 of the world can access the Bitcoin network. And even if the internet got shut down tomorrow, it would have to have a James Bond event with every security agency in the world at the same time, taking out the internet. But then they couldn't take out the Bitcoin network because they now have satellites in space,
Correct.
which power it. So we can't think about these things as not existing. They're not. And banning is just going to push them back out, and people get hurt. So banning doesn't work. And putting your head in the sand and saying, "Oh, this is, we'll just leave it alone," doesn't work too, because people get hurt. Consumers and investors get hurt, and people continue to do bad things. So responsible regulation is important. And if you look at what regulation does, it protects people. So I always say, the crux of what the FATF want in the world of money laundering and terrorism financing is they want to know who's behind things, the beneficial ownership. Now, most companies and most entrepreneurs in the space are very happy to be the beneficial owners of these companies, but they want to go somewhere that they're actually told, this is the law, this is what you need to do, and it's not going to change on them next week.
So if you were to recommend quickly, I know, we are short of the time, but quickly let me complete the questions. If I were to ask you, give me 3 recommendations for the emerging markets to adapt the digital assets, what are the three recommendations that you will make?
Sensible regulation. Sensible regulation. You give legal clarity and legal certainty to the ecosystem, what they can and they can't do. Governments start to embrace the technology of blockchain outside this application we saw of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. That's a very small part. The benefits of blockchain and decentralized systems to fix things like ID systems, because at the biggest point at the moment with centralized databases, every database in history has been hacked. Every government, every company, everybody's database has been hacked. And the cost of a hack, I always argue, with cybersecurity hacks, which are going to happen because hackers like to hack things, is going to be very, very, very costly in the future. So governments understanding how they use the technology to better society, to better people. And I think the third one is that, we embrace technology, and we embrace it in all parts of our lives. And I think everybody, if I could have this word to everybody out there, that maybe they're accountants, they're lawyers, everybody has to have some new ability to code going forward, because no longer is it okay for you just to be a lawyer, or you just to be an accountant, or you just to be a government worker. Everybody needs to understand how this digital economy works. And you need to have some level of coding, because we're all going to have to be multitasking going forward.
Understand. Okay, great.
So educate yourself is the third place. Get out there, think this technology, you mightn't understand it, but just educate yourself.
Okay, got it. Sure. Now, you mentioned also during the discussion about the need for harmonized regulation across the various jurisdictions. We need some kind of harmony. We need some kind of uniformity about the regulations. Now, is this really possible, Loretta, globally?
So interesting you said that, because I started writing regulations in Australia in 2014. Now, what I noticed very quickly is, if I looked at the US is, there's multiple regulators. They're all got state regulation. There are more regulators than you can, poke a stick at. Federal is very different to state. You look at Europe, they can't agree on a euro. They can't agree on anything, because you go 2 kilometers, you've got another country. So having these larger jurisdictions and these larger conglomerates of people come up with regulation is never going to happen. But in the last 50 years, Europe and the US has always led things. But I started to look at common law, and I'm not a lawyer. So I've started to write law, and I looked at Australia, I looked at Canada. You look at the Commonwealth. We all have exactly the same common law. There's 53 countries in the Commonwealth, and they're the biggest emerging markets in the world. They're Africa and India. So my belief is, if I can create harmonized standards and laws that can be adopted and replicated, not so much, replicated, you can use common law regulations,
common law regulations, yes,
regulations, and every country in the Commonwealth can adapt and adapt that and implement that extremely quickly. So I think, yes, it's doable. I think the Commonwealth is the best poised organisation to do that, because it's also got countries that have got the biggest populations in the world. So the Africans, the Indian continent, Australia, Canada, the UK, we all have the ability now to have exactly the same and very harmonised regulatory frameworks, which does two things. It gives clarity to an ecosystem, but if I'm an Indian entrepreneur, or if I'm an Australian entrepreneur, and there's no regulations in India or there's none in Australia, I have to look to go to another country to set up my business.
Absolutely.
Now, the problem with that is that I technologists, they don't understand regulation. So a lot of them have been looking to go to jurisdictions with very, very lax regulation or no regulation. Now, that is inadvertently doesn't serve the purpose of what they need, because they need to set up where regulations are robust enough, they can passport their businesses back into other economies and grow. If they go to countries where they've got no regulation, they're going to have problems with, we've been blacklisted and black banned. So it helps both sides. If the ecosystem can go to any country that has the same laws and same regulations, they can set up everywhere, and regulators and jurisdictions can be comforted by the fact that the regulations that they've got in place stand in 52 other countries, so they will protect the investor and the consumer and stop people doing things for nefarious activities. So I think regulation is really important. I think the Commonwealth and writing regulation in common law, to me, has been the answer, because I want to see not treaties of treaties of tax going forward. I want to see countries have treaties of technology.
Right. So where quickly from there, where do you think, how do you think India should make the beginning in the digital asset space? How could we make a beginning?
So I look at India, and it's got a country of over half the population born after 1991. It's got one of the largest growing middle classes, and India, to me, is probably, it's up there with being the most tech savvy country in the world.
Yeah.
I think the government and the regulators need to bring in sensible regulation. You've got entrepreneurs that are leaving India because there's no clarity. There's no laws and clarity to make them build businesses in India, and they're going off to other places. And I think there'll be a brain drain of talent if sadly this opportunity isn't taken, because I think you need to seize the opportunity and harness the risks of technology. That has risk, but the opportunities and the entrepreneurs of India have the ability now to shine. And I think it's important that the authorities build a sensible regulatory framework that allows this ecosystem and these entrepreneurs to build businesses. I would like to see, the next Googles, the Facebooks, these billion-dollar unicorns come out of India. I don't want to see them come out of the US.
Great. No, I'm really grateful for your optimism, and really thank you for that comment. Let me take you back to your India experience. Indian woman. When last week when we spoke, you were very clear and very again enthusiastic about talking about them. So what would you say, your perspective on Indian women?
Indian women are fantastic. I mean, I've worked with some amazing Indian women, and in banking, I mean, there are some very powerful Indian female bankers that wear power saris that you wouldn't cross. I think Indian women are the fabric of Indian society. I don't have any male friends in India, that don't pick up the phone when their mother calls, and they hold. Indian women do so much. They hold the family together. So many of them work now. They provide you with great food all the time. I mean, India's got some of the most, the most talented, and professional business women in the world. But she also has, all these women are also family women. So I think, if you look at India as a continent and the importance of family and religion and how it's all sort of mixed into each other, it's a democracy. I think India has the biggest opportunity of any country in the world to take technology, to take these new industries and take these new ecosystems and turn them into their own. You have Wipro, you've got Infosys, you've got the Tata Group. Some of the biggest conglomerates in the world come out of India. You've got some of the most amazing people in technology, and a lot of technology, women that are in technology in India. I think if India can embrace this movement, not fear it, because I think at the moment there's a lot of fear that cryptocurrency is bad and they're going to replace, they're not going to take out the rupee. The central bank has nothing to worry about. But there's a lot of, very, very smart Indian kids and technologists that just want to build businesses. And I think India needs to foster her female entrepreneurs more. Yeah, they need to be given the same opportunities as the male entrepreneurs, because you've got some amazing women in tech and in things like I do, cybersecurity. Some of the best people in the world are females in cybersecurity in India.
Great. It has been really fascinating, Loretta, talking to you, and we can just go on, because I know your passion and your enthusiasm about this new digital asset is really, really contagious, I must say. So thank you very much. Any closing comments you would like to make?
Harness the opportunities and mitigate the risks. Don't be scared of technology, because it's here. It's not going away. Digital assets, this asset class is here to stay. I mean, you've got an industry now of what, $1 trillion when I looked this morning. It's not going anywhere. So we embrace it, or we let it overtake us. And I think that would be a shame to do that.
Great. Thank you so much, Loretta, for your really valuable time and great insights. It has been great, a pleasure talking to you.
It's been an absolute pleasure anytime. And if anybody wants to contact me, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm always available to answer questions. I've got, more reference documents than I can poke a stick at. I mean, I learnt all this myself. Don't forget, bankers are not generally technologists, and women that are over 40 don't normally teach themselves to code. My 9-year-old taught me to code. So my last point would be, if you don't understand technology, go and ask your children.
Great. Thank you so much, Loretta. So I would like to thank the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Indian Chamber of Commerce, LawSeco, and the India SME Accelerator Network. Let me conclude with a humble prayer to the Almighty to bestow mankind with the right spirit to fight the coronavirus and help restore peace, prosperity, and well-being. Thank you so much, Loretta. It has been a great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Nitin. Have a good day.
Thank you.